Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. We have been discussing about some of the women of the Mahabharata. Let us continue our study today. We have seen how the great Draupadi had functioned. We have also seen what it means to have Draupadi and the five Pandavas. The Mahabharata is a huge story. In fact, it is not a story, but lessons for life encapsulated into an itihasa. This Mahabharata has several women. By looking at Draupadi, we have seen a key character. Today, I would like to look at some of the unimportant, the so-called unimportant women characters of the Itihasa, and then probably discuss about yet another key character. I would like to start with a particular woman whose name is not very clearly known. She is an Ananika, a one with no name. She has been referred to by most of the commentators as the Patibrata. Some of you might have guessed as to what story we're going to look into. Let's remind ourselves of what happened. Here was a lady much devoted to her husband, at the same time trying to live by dharmic principles. An Atiti going to her doorstep will always be looked after very well. And one fine morning, we have one Atiti, one sage, going to her doorstep, asking for alms. He just said, Bhavati Bhikshandehi. She came out, saw the vessel that he had in his hand, noticing that the vessel was not clean. She took it in her arms. She wanted to clean it. She told him she will do so, took the vessel inside, and was in the process of cleaning it when her husband returned from some other work. Looking at her husband and looking that she had to tend to his demands, and realizing that the husband was tired and hungry, she just left the vessel there, forgot about the Atiti waiting at the doorstep, because her focus was completely on the husband. She came back home, came inside, looked after the husband, served him food, and as she was serving food, she suddenly remembered there was someone waiting at the doorstep. So she ran out, told that sage, kindly wait for some time. Let me finish what I have at hand and come back. And she did. After a few minutes, she came back. She came back to the sage and kind of apologized. By then, she also brought the cleaned up vessel. She also brought food for this Aditi. Now, this sage looked up at that woman. His eyes were bloodshot. He was angry. His eyes were red with anger and so bloodshot. He looked at her and asked her, "What do you think of yourself, you ordinary mortal woman? You think that you can make me wait? You took the vessel, you went in, you did not even bother about me. You made me wait for such a long time. Not only that, you came out and said, please wait. You know who I am? Even people like sages would not dare do this. Why sages? Why human beings? Even Devendra would not do this to me. And you, ordinary mortal woman, a woman living in the forest, could do this?" This lady had some motherly compassion in her. She looked at the sage and said, "I'm sorry. I did not want to demean you. I did not want to humiliate you. But my husband is a god to me, and I have the duty of tending to his demands. I have to give him what he requires, and he was hungry. I had to give him food. So I undertook that primary responsibility, and then after that, I came and gave you food. I understand you're great, but I also understand that you would be great enough to give me apologies." The sage would still not come down in his anger, and this time, without saying anything, he just looked at her. In his mind, he remembered another incident which had happened a few days ago. This sage was in the forest. He was performing a lot of penance. And after some time, he decided to move out of that forest and reach another area. So he started his journey. One afternoon, when he was resting under a tree, there was a crane flying up. And this crane, it is after all a bird, and this crane had thrown its excreta, which fell on this sage. The sage would not tolerate. He just looked up. How could an ordinary crane dirty me? It has thrown its excreta on me. How could it do that? So he looked up, and as he looked up in anger, the crane, that bird, just went aflame. There was fire in his eyes, and that fire would kill the crane. This sage remembered that incident. He knew his anger could kill people. He knew his anger could just make anything go up in flames. With that thought, he looked at this woman. He probably thought within his mind, we do not know, maybe he thought, that crane which did not respect me went up in flames, and this lady who was not respecting me would also go up in flames. He just looked at her. And what did this woman do? She smilingly looked at him and said, it's a beautiful statement in Tamil, "Kokkendru ninaithayo konganava." She just asked him, "You think I'm the crane? You think I'm akin to the crane?" The crane incident happened a few days ago in the forest. And how did this lady know that? The sage was taken aback. Not only did this lady survive his anger, she did not go up in flames. She was there, all in body and soul, and she also questioned his anger. She asked him, "You think that I'm akin to the crane, that I would go up in flames? You thought I would do that? No, I'm here." And the story continues, all of us know. That is when the sage decided he would seek knowledge and wisdom from this lady. Of course, she guided him. She asked him to go to another guru, and he went. Let us not go into those details of the story, but then stand here and look at this great lady. What is her name? We do not know. She has been referred to as the Patibrata. The sage, of course, has been named Kaushika, and there are some versions of the Mahabharata where he is given other names too. However, there is an identity given to the sage, but there is no identity specifically given to this woman. Why so? It is not the name that matters. In fact, name is an identity. But most of us have a kind of affinity to the name. We think the name is important. All of us may be very familiar with a kind of a circumstance that often occurs. Let us think of a hypothetical situation when someone is giving us an invitation for some function or ceremony. My friend is giving me an invitation. This friend knows me for the last 20 years. It may happen that this friend, while writing my name on the invitation, may spell it wrong, may not write my full name, and may kind of change the last part of the name or the first part of the name, or one syllable here, one syllable there. Just think of it. How do most of us react? You know me for so many years. You do not even know my name. And what do we do after that? This person does not even know my name. Why should I go for this wedding? Why should I respect this invitation? We do not want to respect the invitation primarily because that person did not know our names correctly. That means we have so much of affinity to the name, we give so much of importance to the name, and we think the name is the end all and the be all. What's in a name? The name is an identity. The name becomes important to us because it is our name. It is my name, the mamakara, which resides inside. We do not even know the name of this lady. For ages, we have been referring to her as the Pativrata, that is all. But what does this term Pativrata indicate? She took her responsibility of looking after her husband as her vratam. She took that responsibility as her tapas. Now, what is a tapas? The sage here had performed so much of tapas. He was a great tapasvi, and that is why, with the fire of his tapas, the fire of the benefits of his tapas, he could even kind of burn the crane. He was a tapasvi. And what is the difference between this tapas and the tapas or the vratam that this Patibrata performed? I would not say the sage was a real tapasvi. He had performed some yajnas, true. He had performed some tapas, true. He had performed some sacrifices. But was he able to sacrifice his ego? Was he able to sacrifice his affinity to I? Was he able to sacrifice his ahankara and mamakara? If he had been a true tapasvi, he should have apologized the woman when she said, "I'm sorry, I made you wait. Now here I've brought the bhiksha." He did not have that grace to do so. On the other hand, she had performed so much of tapas that she even knew what happened in the forest days ago. She had so much of jnana drishti that she could see a crane going up in flames, not being physically present at that place, but continuing to do her regular routine work. Doing work is not against tapas, but she performed that work not with the sense of ego, not with that I consciousness, but she did it with all the concentration of doing a tapas. And that is why we do not even give her a separate name, a name which will indicate an affinity to I, but we call her the Patibrata. My dear sisters, it is for us to now remember that Pativrata is a generic statement or a generic identity, and this identity holds good for most of the women in our land and culture. It holds good for not only those Puranic women, Itihasic women, or historic women, but it holds good for almost all women who continue to live in this land, adapting themselves to the dharmic principles of this culture. Pativrata lived yesterday. Pativrata lives today, and Pativrata will continue to live tomorrow. The existence of Pativrata is perennial, and that is why Vedavyasa saw to that she was not given a specific name. You give a specific name, the matter ends there. It cannot be applied to others. But when you say Pativrata, the generic term can be applied to every Indian woman, every great woman of this land. We also find another small woman character in the Mahabharata. In fact, she just appears to have a conversation with a king. She has been called Sulabha. In the Janaka dynasty of the Videha country was a king by name Dharmadvaja. Dharmadvaja, Dharma as his flagstaff. So Dharma was the basis on which the kingdom was ruled. We all know the kings of the Videha country were all called by the name Janaka. It was a kind of a surname or a kind of a family name. The word Janaka means father. The king will be like a father to the citizens of the country, and that is why all the kings of the Videha land were called Janaka. They would have their names, and to that name will be the suffix Janaka. So we have Kshiradvaja Janaka, Kushadvaja Janaka, Dharmadvaja Janaka, and so on. Sita's father in the Ramayana was a Janaka. He was also a king of the Videha land, and he was Kshiradvaja Janaka. Kshiradvaja Janaka will mean someone who had the clarity of Dharma as his flagstaff. Now we are looking at Dharmadvaja Janaka, who belonged to the same lineage. He was a great man. He was a Raja Rishi. He ruled his kingdom well. He gave all that the citizens needed, and he was respected. He was also a Jnani. To him came Sulabha, who was the daughter of another Rajarishi, and engaged herself in a philosophical conversation. And if we look at that conversation, we could understand the level at which Sulabha was. We will not go into the details of that conversation now, but try to understand that here was a young girl who had the courage to face a king, a very seasoned king, and talk to him, converse with him, argue with him on matters of philosophy. How deep was her knowledge that the king would acknowledge her wisdom and give her equal respect, if not more. She was called Sulabha. Why? With her wisdom, she was at ease. With her wisdom, she could travel anywhere. With her wisdom, she could even get into things and come out of them. Sulabha, to me, is the personification of wisdom that every great woman of this land possesses. I would not think of Sulabha as an individual, but then think of that form as the personification of the easy flow of wisdom and knowledge and compassion that every great woman has had. These women were wise, but they utilized their wisdom for the goodness of others. It is in the same Mahabharata that we have another great woman, a woman who could not bring her child up, a woman who apparently could not be the wife to her husband, and a woman who could not probably do whatever she wanted to do. Have you guessed as to whom I'm pointing to? Someone who had to kind of throw her firstborn away. Yes, you guessed it right. and it is Kunti. Kunti was born to whom? We call her Kunti because she is the daughter of Kunti Boja. But was she born to Kunti Boja? Let us try and go back and look at what happened. There were two cousins. As children, these cousins, when they played, kind of told each other, when we grow up, if supposing you don't have a child, don't worry, I will give my firstborn to you. So what happened? One of them, of the two cousins, one of them grew up as Kunti Boja. He became a king and did not have issues. Here was the other, to whom was born a small little girl as the firstborn child. Of course, after this girl, he also had a son. But what was the original contract? If you do not have a child, I will give my firstborn. So, this man, whose firstborn child was Pritha, sent Pritha as a daughter to Kunti Boja. Please remember, it is the custom of this land to call a daughter after the father's name. We have already seen Janaki is the daughter of Janaka. Parvati is the daughter of Parvata. Dakshayani is the daughter of Daksha. Draupadi is the daughter of Drupada, and so on. So this little girl, Pritha, who was called Pritha in her biological house, when she was sent on Swikar, she was called Kunti because she became the daughter of Kunti Boja Maharaj. And what happened after that? Kunti grew up there in that house. She was just about a small girl of 7 or 8 when sage Durvasa came to that country. Sages, when they are transiting from one place to another, had the habit of visiting some country or the king and would be the guest of that king for some time. Those were days when they could not travel fast. They had to go through forests. So if they get a place to rest for a few days so that they can continue their travel, they would rest there. Sage Durvasa came to this land of Kunti Boja and was a guest there. The Maharaj brought his daughter and told the sage, this little girl will be your servant until you stay here, and she would look you after well. And this little girl did everything that the sage wanted. She would clean up the place. She would fetch him food. She would fetch him fruits. She would do everything that the sage wanted. She would run errands. And the description is that sometimes the sage would just come in and say, within the next 5 minutes, I want food. And she would cook food in 5 minutes and serve hot food. And so one day, the sage wanted food in such a way that there was no place that he could keep his plantain leaf. So he told Kunti, Kunti, come on here, come, bend. You bend and let me keep this plantain leaf on your back. Just think of it, a small little girl who just bent and the sage would spread the plantain leaf on her back and then eat hot food. How difficult it would have been for her, and how hot that leaf would have been. She tolerated all that. It is very difficult to get a good name with Sage Durvasa. All of us know that. Even mature people were not able to get a good name from him. But this little girl did everything that the sage was so pleased. And as he departed, he gave her a mantra. The sage, who knew the past, the present, and the future, probably would have thought that there will be a necessity for such a mantra in her future life. He gave her a mantra and left. And we know what happened after that. This little girl, curious to see what the mantra was, pronounced the mantra, and that is when Lord, the sun god, Lord Surya, came down and gave her a child. A small little girl, not yet married. She did not even know what to do. She had a child in hand, and she left the child along the river, keeping the child, placing the child in a small little casket, and giving all protection with her own clothing, and the child went past. We all know that this child only became Karna later on. The child, the casket rather, was found by Radeya, who happened to be a charioteer in that kingdom. And Radeya picked up this casket, brought up the child, and the child was also subsequently called Radeya because the mother's name was also Radha. So the story continues. But then, what happened to this little girl? This little girl grew up. She was to be married, and she was married to Prince Pandu of Hastinapura. It was a very, very cruel fate that Pandu was to go to the forest in exile. It was a kind of a self-imposed exile. Nobody asked him to go, but then he decided that he would go to the forest with both his wives. By then he had married another woman, the princess of the Madra kingdom called the Madri. So with Kunti and Madri, he left for forest. And it was in the forest that he wanted to have children. But then because of a curse from a rishi, he knew that he cannot have children through his wives. He cannot have direct children through his wives. That is when Kunti told him about the mantra, and then we know what happened. Kunti used the mantra thrice, and then she was also graceful enough to give the mantra to her co-wife, and Madri had Nakula and Sahadeva. When Pandu died, Madri, who was responsible in a way for his death, left her soul on that funeral pyre. She performed sati and died along with Pandu. She entrusted the responsibility of bringing up her two sons to Kunti. So along with her three sons, Kunti also had to look after Nakula and Sahadeva. And she never made any difference. All the five were equal to her. She looked at all five of them as her own sons. Never did she make any kind of a difference. The only difference she ever made was in keeping a larger share of food for Bhima, the second son. Of the five, Bhima was the strongest physically, and Bhima would always want a little more food than the other four. So the only difference that probably Kunti did was to keep him a larger share of food. Whenever she had to keep food for these children, she would keep a larger share for Bhima and give the rest of the four equal share. That apart, she never made any difference. And after Pandu's death, Bhishmacharya would bring her back to the kingdom along with the five brothers, and the story continued. How difficult it would have been for Kunti to see that her sons and her daughter-in-law were sent to the forest for 12 years and for one additional year in guise. How grief-struck she would have been to see what happened in that game of dice. She went through all that. She stood by Dharma. She stood firm. She did not pronounce any single curse on anyone. I'm tempted to compare, though I know it is not perfectly correct to compare, but I'm tempted to compare between Kunti on one side and Gandhari on the other. Gandhari, with her 100 children, still would pronounce a curse when her children had some kind of grief on them. When some misfortune befall on her children, Gandhari would pronounce a curse. We all know Gandhari pronounced a curse that brought the downfall of even the Krishna avatar. But here was Kunti, who would not even say anything wrong about anyone else, even when her children had to go to the forest. And what happened subsequently? She came to know that Karna was her son, and she was standing at the crossroads that either Karna would live or one of the other five would live. Krishna told her, you will definitely have 5 sons, which means she would have to lose one of them. And she knew at some point of time, because Karna was on the side of Adharma, she would have to lose her firstborn. And when she had to tell openly that Karna was her son, just imagine the kind of sorrow that she would have gone through. When Yudhishthira came and asked her, Amma, why are you crying for the death of Karna? How would she have felt? And what pain she would have undergone all through the years, knowing that her firstborn had been thrown into water primarily because of the circumstances. Who would understand her? You know what happened ultimately? We could look at Kunti as to what she was in that final act that she performed. That is where we understand what Kunti was. But before we go to that final act, let us also see another instance that happened. The Kurukshetra war was over. Yudhishthira became the king. And apparently all the trouble that the Pandavas had gone through was over. So Krishna came to Kunti. Some of my sisters would still remember as to where we started Kunti's story. Kunti was born as Pritha, isn't it? That is the reason we call Arjuna as Partha. Pritha's son becomes Partha, and that is why Krishna is called Partha Sarathi, because he became the Sarathi for Partha. Partha is Pritha's son. Now Pritha, we saw, was the firstborn to someone, and that someone had another son also, isn't it? Go back to that bit of the story. Pritha was the daughter of Suradeva, who was also the father of Vasudeva, and Vasudeva's son was Krishna. And that is why Krishna kept on calling Kunti as aunt, Attai. She was the Attai or the aunt of Krishna because she was Vasudeva's biological sister. Now, this Pritha had gone to Kunti Bhoja and had become Kunti. Now come back to that situation when Krishna comes after the war, after settling everything. Now everybody is happy because the coronation is over and seemingly joy all over. Now Krishna came to Kunti and then asked her, Aunt, are you happy now? All your troubles are over. You had so much of trouble. You had to go to the forest. You know, when she was a young wife to Pandu, she had to go to the forest and live in the forest. The children were all born in the forest. The 5 Pandavas were born only in the forest. None of them were born in the palace. You had to suffer there. Then when you came back to the palace, there again you had to suffer because the Kauravas, especially Duryodhana, was so jealous of the Pandavas. There was always some kind of hostility and enmity. You had to suffer that. You had to see the suffering of your daughter-in-law. You had to see that your children went to the forest again. All those difficulties, all those troubles are over. Ate, are you happy? All your troubles are over now. Are you happy? You know what Kunti said? That goes as what is called Kunti Stuti. She had a prarthana to make. She made a stuti. She made a stotram to Krishna. She said, Krishna, please give me more difficulties. Please give me more difficulties. Why? Because only when we have difficulties, Krishna, we keep thinking of you. Very true, isn't it? When we are all happy and joyful, we do not think of God. But when there is some difficulty, even the slightest of the slight difficulty, we immediately say, God, don't you have eyes? Are you not looking at me? And you have thrust me with so much of sorrow. She asked, please give me difficulties, Krishna, so that we always remember you, so that I would be able to always think of you, and I would spend all my time and energy on God. After this, Krishna left for Dwarka. At Hastinapur, the kingdom continued. Yudhishthira was ruling. Some years went past. Now please remember, the Kauravas were not alive, which means the father of the Kauravas, Dhritarashtra, was there without his sons, and Gandhari, who had tied up her eyes, was also there. The 2 old people, the father and the mother, who had lost all their children, were living in the same palace. After some years, both Dhritarashtra and Gandhari understood as to where they were. They kind of understood their sons were at fault, and they were now being looked after by the same Pandavas who were not given their equal share, who were deprived of their legitimate share. Dhritarashtra realized he was not kind to the Pandavas. Yielding to the words of Duryodhana, he was always partial. And he was now living in the same palace at the mercy of the Pandavas. Of course, Yudhishthira and the rest of the Pandavas did respect Dhritarashtra. But then Dhritarashtra decided that he would resign to the forests, perform tapas there, and spend the rest of his life in the forest as a kind of a compensation to what he was in the earlier years. So he decided to quit. As he decided to quit, Gandhari went along with him. She, after all, had tied her eyes because her husband could not see. But then imagine two people who are blind in effect. One blind to the core, the other one who cannot see because she has taken it as a vow. Both of them retiring to the forest. What would happen? Where would they go? Old people with no sight also. And you know what happened? Dhritarashtra placed his hand on the shoulders of Gandhari and walked. Gandhari placed her hand on the shoulders of a person who could see the world, who could physically see the world, and she led. Who else was that? It was Kunti. Kunti led Gandhari and Gandhari led Dhritarashtra. Here was Kunti, who had suffered all through her life, primarily because of the Kauravas and because of the partiality shown by Dhritarashtra. She decided to be the eyesight to those two of them, King Dhritarashtra and Queen Gandhari. What better example do we need for greatness? Sisters and brothers, let's think of this greatness that the Indian women have shown. Let us remain in the glory of Kunti for yet another week and meet up next time in the greatness of the great Indian women. Thank you. Namaskar.